Welcome to episode 57 of the Filmumentaries podcast. It's late here in London. I'm trying to get this episode up before August ends. It's like 10:30 p.m. here in London. This is Jamie Benning talking to you here from my bunker of movie delights. Not really. It's August 2022, as I said, just about. September is tomorrow. But as promised, here is the second episode for August, and I'm pretty sure you're going to love it. If you're new to the podcast, you're very welcome. Check out some of the 56 episodes that came before this one. You know, cherry pick the ones where the guests are someone you know of or worked on a film you like. And then do me a favour and dig into the ones that you know nothing about, and I guarantee you'll enjoy them just as much, and if not more. If you're a regular listener, welcome back. And if you support the podcast via patreon.com/Jamie Benning, JamieBenning, then may you win every bid on that sought-after movie item on eBay. Thanks to all of you who support this very independent podcast. It is just me, my laptop, and a guest or guests. Whether it's via Patreon, retweeting on Twitter, posting about it on Facebook, leaving a review, replying to a post on Instagram. I really do appreciate it. As I said, I am independent and it's a small podcast. I have a small but committed listenership, and I'd love to get it out there to more people that like the stuff that we like. Okay, back to the meat of this episode then. I don't really have much in the way of film artifacts these days. I have a couple of replica Star Wars helmets just over there. I have just above me some NECA Alien and Jaws action figures looking down at me, and a few books over there. But my guest this week, however, has not only a super impressive collection, he's also responsible for 3 of the best comedies ever written, 3 of my favourites in fact: Seinfeld, Curb Your Enthusiasm and Veep. Yeah, I know, crazy. I have writer and executive producer David Mandel on the show. It's getting kind of bonkers that I get to speak to these people whose work I love so much. And it turns out that David has an interest in the kind of movies that you and I love as well. Also, as a wonderful DVD special feature type bonus, I'm joined by my friend and former Filmumentaries podcast guest, Emmy Award winning matte artist Jim Maxwell. You'll have seen Jim's work in Vikings Valhalla, maybe even in Curb Your Enthusiasm. Now you see the connection. Jim has worked as a VFX matte painter for some 20 years. He had a short stint at ILM. He's an owner of several items relevant to the conversation you're about to hear as well. And as I said, Jim put me in contact with David. So yeah, a new thing for the Filmumentaries podcast. We have a co-host this week. So if you're unfamiliar with our voices, you'll hear me first. You should recognize that from this very intro. Then you'll hear David, and then you'll hear the silky Toronto tones of Jim Maxwell. So here is Jim Maxwell and I having a chat about comedy, filmmaking, prop collecting with the wonderful David Mandel, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. David, what was the first thing that turned you on to the creative world of movie making?
You know, it's funny. I guess when I think about it, my mom loved movies. I mean, my dad loved certain kinds of movies. Like, my dad we went to James Bond movies. Like, that was one of the first movies that I remember going to with him. And my dad took me to Star Wars, and we sat through it twice. He was very big on getting your money's worth and sitting through it twice if it was a really good movie. And so we definitely did those things. But my mom loved movies and loved television, and so she was the one that was more like, oh, we're going to go to, there's a theater near us that's having a Hitchcock retrospective, and it's like, well, who's Hitchcock, what's Hitchcock? So there was definitely that part of it. But one of my earliest memories, which is just so bizarre, was in America. They published when Saturday Night Live was sort of at its height, they published this it was like a paper script book. It was a large softcover script book, as if there was a fake episode being hosted by Generalissimo Franco. That was the fake guest host of the week. But in it, it then also had like actual sketches from the show, which I kind of watched a little bit and knew a little bit about at like age, 9 or so, 8 or 9, when I think this book came out. And that was the first time I ever saw like, I don't know, like scripts and behind the scene photos and those things. And that definitely, I'm not going to sit here and say to you, like at that moment, I, swore to the heavens that I would become a comedy writer, that I would work at Saturday Night Live. But it's a visceral memory of seeing like scripts and how things are actually made. And, over the years from there, as I kind of got into like, sci-fi and movie stuff on my own, it was stuff like magazines like Starlog magazine that, just started to have like a lot of these behind the scenes. And I used to be very big on the novelizations of movies, if you remember those. And I was always fascinated. Like there was a Wrath of Khan novelization that had scenes that were not in the movie, and sort of began to sort of figure out, some of those were in the script and some of those were shot. And then years later, when they did the director's cut, some of those popped back up. And, you begin to you start to put some of these things together. But those are some of like the early experiences that made me, what's the word I'm looking for? Start to realize somebody was making these things. If that, you know what I mean? Like that, they just weren't happening. So those are some of the early things. Yeah.
And that kind of makes you then realize that, people make these. Maybe I could make these. Maybe I've got a shot at this.
It's funny, even though that the logical jump would be, people make these. I want to do something. I could make these. That one took a lot longer and a lot harder. That jump. I was definitely, deep into, all through high school, I should say. My buddies and I, my core group of, buddies, we were definitely, going down to Greenwich Village in New York and going to the cool movie poster store and going to Jerry Orlinger's to buy like 8x10 black and whites of like, I want to get a shot from that scene from After Hours because Scorsese was our guy. And, just all of these kinds of moments where I was definitely really into it. And in terms of like movies, going to the movies every Friday night, every Saturday night, sometimes 2 movies on a Saturday, and then, sleeping over at a buddy's house and like watching 4 or 5 movies, staying up as late as we could, just, watching stuff and trying to fill in the holes. And so very into it, very into my television watching. And yet, I don't know, it wasn't, like I always laugh when I think about being in college, like going to college. My thought was maybe I'd be like an entertainment lawyer. I just didn't necessarily know, like I knew people did it, but I didn't quite realize I could do it or I should do it, I guess, in some combination of that. So yeah, it was a little slower to that.
And you went to Harvard for college. And what was your undergrad? What was your focus?
I was a government major, which came in very handy, first at Saturday Night Live and then later at Veep. It came in very, very handy. I graduated what they call cum laude general studies, which means basically I got to Harvard, never wrote a thesis, never achieved any sort of distinction in anything that I was supposed to be studying, because kind of what happened was I got to Harvard, and that's again where you start to put things together. And I got there, and there was this weird building, this castle that was the headquarters of the Harvard Lampoon. And all of a sudden I went, wait a second, Harvard Lampoon, National Lampoon, Doug Kenny, different writers, Jim Downey at Saturday Night Live, et cetera, et cetera. And all of a sudden it was like, I want to join that. And again, I'm not talking about knowing what I was going to do with my life, but I was like, I want to get in that place. And first I didn't get in. It took me a while to get in. But once I got in, it was sort of like everything else went out the door, basically. I mean, I barely went to class. A buddy of mine used to joke that we treated Harvard like it was a trade school. Like it might as well have been like we might as well have learned electronic circuitry. Because honestly, once I was involved with the Lampoon, that is all I did. It was all I kind of cared about. So yeah.
And the Harvard Lampoon was such a launching point for, so many people in the entertainment industry. So
Yeah, I mean,
Conan
O'Brien's
O'Brien,
the
and
biggie. Yeah, exactly. Of course. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And would you have crossed paths with him through?
Later on,
Okay.
as an undergrad, when I was there as an undergrad, The Simpsons was starting to it started to become big, or soon thereafter became big. So there was a sense of, I guess, the guys that became the Simpsons guys. I'm sure I'm missing a year or two. I'm probably off by a couple of years there. Actually, that might have been the back end. At that point, I remember there was a wonderful writer, Paul Simms, who now is the exec producer and showrunner on Shadows, the vampire show. Forgive me. What We Do in the Shadows. Yeah, What We Do in the Shadows. And he was at Spy Magazine, which for us was the be-all, end-all. And Spy Magazine had been co-founded by Kurt Anderson, who was an older grad. And then I remember when we heard Paul Simms got hired at Letterman, which was that was the big dream, Letterman. So though there were guys we were hearing about that we were they were closer to our age, that were still kind of coming back and coming around back up to Harvard for grad events, as opposed to maybe the California guys like Conan and stuff, who were names we knew. But again, there was that sense of people were doing this in these incredible places. So yeah.
And now you're immersed in this world. Did you still have this love for movies, or were you kind of so focused on the other side of things?
1,000%. No, movies was still a huge part of it. And at that point, and again, it's that funny thing of, until you're in the actual business and you kind of get into it, and all of a sudden you realize, oh, you're either a TV writer or a movie writer. So when you don't know anything, it's just I just want to write movies and TV. But obviously it's a very, well, now they're barely is a movie industry, but when there was a movie industry, the two things were very separate. In fact, one of the things that I learned as I started getting into it, it's always that funny thing. When I was a sketch writer, there was always this sense of well, sure, you can write 5-minute sketches, but how are you going to write a 22-minute sitcom? And then when you're a sitcom writer, it's well, sure, you can do these 22-minute sitcoms, but how would you ever write an hour and a half? So it's oddly a segmented industry, or at least an industry that tries to put you in your place, or put you in a place and define you in a box. And, it's a bit of a cliche, but it is very much how the industry works. It's sort of you get kind of fit into your little groove, and occasionally you get to escape from it, but not often.
Yeah, I work in live TV, and I've done so for 20 or so years, and I wanted to be in film, and the perception of TV when I joined was, TV was poor man's film. It was full of people who wanted to be in film but didn't quite make it. Of course, that's changed a lot now, and it's kind of flipped on its head.
That is obviously definitely changed, but certainly in the early days, I mean, the biggest way that I sort of, I guess, got into film, so to speak, was coming off of Seinfeld. I was working a lot with the guys that became my writing partners for a number of years, Jeff Schaefer and Alec Berg. We'd been in college together. We were in the Lampoon together. We lived in the same dorm together, and then I was at SNL, they were at the Conan O'Brien show. Then they moved out to LA, went to work on Seinfeld, and then I joined them on Seinfeld, and we wrote both separately and together on Seinfeld. And then when Seinfeld ended, we began to get some movie punch-up work as Seinfeld writers. Movies where people were not hiring us to write the movie, but feeling that their comedies, for lack of a better word, could be smarter, that they were looking for that Seinfeld sense of humor. And that was really sort of our, I don't know, not exactly a back door, but sort of a back door into the movie industry. Was at first just doing punch up on other people's things as the Seinfeld guys that could come in and take something and kind of go through it quickly and make it funnier. That was kind of our way in. But always, even in that way, initially as these, still defined in a way by our TV credentials, which was a good TV credential. It wasn't a bad TV credential, but it was still, again, how the industry defined us, so.
You've had the trajectory from the Harvard Lampoon onwards, and then working with Alec Berg, who was a longtime friend of yours. Yep. And I sort of as an outsider perspective of someone writing, so many hit shows and eventually moving into film and having success there, the sense of responsibility, but also your own sense of confidence. I mean, you must have had a kind of quality to lean on each other.
Look, we were very good friends. I think look, how does one say this? I think good comedy writers don't lack for ego, and dare I say that is one of the sort of more interesting things that the Lampoon sort of fosters, whether purposely or not. There is very much a I don't know what to refer to, sort of a comedy alpha dog thing that goes on there, which is to say, it's not about like, oh, I'm just going to be stronger than them or bench press more or shoot more baskets. It's I'm going to be funnier than them. And I'm going to be funnier in a way that other people know it and it is in your face. And whether that means early on learning in some ways the jokes not to pitch, if that makes any sense, but later on, pushing yourself for the joke that no one else can think of. And so I don't think we certainly didn't lack for confidence even before we were perhaps getting the good gigs. And then the good gigs kind of came along, which of course only increase your confidence. But no, the truth is when Jeff Alec and I were working together, I mean, we genuinely felt like we were really good and we were really funny and we were, coming off of Seinfeld where we had written some really good episodes. We'd learned a shitload. I learned to write shows from Larry David. I'm very lucky. I learned to write sketch comedy from Jim Downey and Al Franken at Saturday Night Live. Other people too, but those two guys especially. And then I learned to write sitcoms at a time when sitcoms were changing. And if you, really want to think about it, the way Seinfeld really changed, you don't have any of these single camera sitcoms if Seinfeld doesn't exist. It's so different from most other shows. And so first on Seinfeld, basically learning sort of to kind of keep story moving and outlining and intertwining storylines. And then obviously later on into Curb Your Enthusiasm, which in some ways maybe distilled it that much more. But where I was going with it ultimately is, we were very confident that, given half a chance, we could do it better. And in some ways, and again, it's a very strange thing to say, like, something like Eurotrip, look, was it the box office success that any of us wanted? No. Does it have issues? Yes. That being said, when we set out just what we set out to do, which was to write a movie basically write a movie, spec a movie, and that people would have no choice to let us direct, that came from working on all these other movies, seeing directors that we thought were just kind of terrible. Not all of them, but just sometimes like, why is that guy directing a movie? Or in some cases, being brought in like when a movie was finished and being asked to watch something and then go, well, they want help fixing it. And you go into the edit room and it's like, well, where's the close-up? Well, we don't have the close-up. Well, where's this? Well, the director decided to do it in a oneer. Well, where's this? We don't have, all of those things where, look, some of it was ego where you just start to go, fuck, we could do this. We could fucking do it better. Lord knows we couldn't do it any worse. So we're going to do it. And going back to Eurotrip, again, the finished movie, there's definitely a lot of lessons to be learned from the way the finished movie was. However, as what's the word? Again, you try not to sound like too big an asshole. In terms of making a plan, the plan was we're going to write a movie and we're going to sell it and they're going to let us direct it. We wrote a movie. We had a bidding war. We sold it for a crap load of money and they let us direct it. I mean, it was a mission accomplished, even if perhaps, again, I wish there had been the second one, as they say. And unfortunately, we were just always, I don't know, we never, it was interesting with our movie stuff. We definitely had some big successes. I'm not sure, and again, I'm speaking now for myself. I don't want to put words in Jeff and Alec's mouth. I'm not sure we ever really had a movie that we were sort of super happy with, which is, I guess, the biggest difference for me with television versus movies. And maybe it's the control, even when we were directing, but it's the control of the writer or what we now call the showrunner or the exec producer, however you want to define that, where so much of my TV I am truly, truly happy with. I mean, whereas the movie stuff, I can look back and go, it was an interesting experience. I'm proud of parts of it. Well, at the time, it was a huge deal. I can say all of those things. The movies are the movies. They're not I'm not quite sure we ever quite made one I love. And that's okay, but it's a truth.
Yeah. And did that give you a kind of better appreciation of people that have managed to have huge success in movies again and again and again, like Scorsese, someone you mentioned earlier?
I mean, absolutely. Although it also separates you, I mean, again, from the people that have giant successes that you actually also think are good. And then, of course, the movies where you just go, why are the audience seeing that? And why are they not going to my movie? And things of that nature. So, it does both. But look, it's obviously... The part about the movie thing, which, you never quite wrap your head around, is like, you work on something for, like, in some cases, even in a sped up system where like, for example, just to pick Eurotrip, we wrote the movie, we sold it, we had the way the deal was done, they had to kind of green light it by like the end of the summer. We were in pre-production the following winter, finished it by like, June or end of June, July of, I think, 2003, and it came out the spring of 2004. That's a tight schedule, and yet it was still, 2 years of our lives. And it was over in 5 minutes. I mean, Friday morning, it was like, they were like, oh, you're going to come in third behind like an Adam Sandler movie that was on its third or fourth week at that point. And something else, what was it, with... I think it was Welcome to Mooseport, I think, where the former president who's living in a small town runs for mayor or in the small town against the... Anyway, I mean, it was over. I mean, just over. And that was insane. Whereas with television, which can be miserable in its own right, and I can remember, Larry David staring at the... sometimes like, we'd be like 12 or 13 episodes through a season of Seinfeld, but the board had 22 spaces and staring up at that, like, how are we going to do this? And yet you make many of them and they come out and they, you feel good about things and you feel good about the reaction because there is reaction and, it kind of keeps you going. And that's even with the shorter seasons of a Curb or a Veep, which were different because they weren't network and those were different in their own ways in that everything about like Curb Your Enthusiasm vis-a-vis Larry, and then certainly like with Veep for myself, the difference there is, and again, I don't want to talk for Jeff and Alec. With Eurotrip, none of us are happy. There are definitely, things that we couldn't do, things we weren't allowed to do. By the way, including the title. We to this day, the name Eurotrip absolutely sucks. We sold the movie, and the movie was always intended to be called Ugly Americans. And the studio forced us to change that movie title because at the time... there was a sense that it wouldn't be patriotic and that people would be turned off by who knows what their insanity was, all these years later. So even just that, what's the word I'm looking for? That giving in on the title, which we had no choice. We had no choice. The movie, if we wanted the movie to come out, it was like it had to be Eurotrip because they were trying to sell it as like an unofficial sequel to Road Trip, which, by the way, was all they knew how to market. I mean, there were so many problems with ultimately all of the release of that movie, but which is not the point of the story. But I guess where I'm going with it is, whereas something like Veep, HBO allowed me to sort of hone and do that show exactly the way I wanted to do it. And there is... I can like, maybe there's 2 tiny little things where I'm like, I would change those, and that's about it. And that's in 3 seasons and almost 30 episodes and, 5 years of my life. And so the same is sort of true on Curb as well. And again, that's Larry's show. I got to participate in it. But, on the many seasons of that I got to work on, just no regrets. Everything is what I think it should be, and certainly it's what Larry wants it to be. So, it just, and that's a very, that to me is what people don't necessarily understand these days about the difference between great TV and the movie business. Is that's what, with a place like HBO, it can be. That's the easiest way. Yeah.
It must be a strange thing with film to where you can't kind of gauge it on how much effort and work you're putting in. So I worked really hard on this doesn't equal to success of the box office, especially nowadays. And I sort of wonder between, no matter how good your writing is, you always have good people, or potentially you hope you're going to have good people that you're working with, which you did have with Seinfeld, Curb, and Veep. And I sort of wonder that playground of, say, Seinfeld, where you have all these established characters, because you came in at, what, 1995?
Yeah, I mean, I came in for basically the back 3 years. So Larry's last season and the 2 seasons that Jerry ran without Larry, basically.
Right, and then you're working with Larry, and then you're working with Julia in Veep, and with something like The Dictator. I just imagine it must make your life easier when you have a good ensemble of people. So I'm just thinking of the scenes in The Dictator with Jason Mantzoukas, Fred Armisen, and Sacha Baron Cohen, and that's the restaurant scene is my favorite.
Yeah,
part of that whole thing.
It's probably one of the best scenes in the movie that really works for a variety of reasons. Casting, as you put it, a huge part of it, but also just everything about it is sort of firing on all cylinders. And obviously, look, I wish that The Dictator was that for 2 hours. It ain't.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? And it was, in other ways too. It was a hard shoot. It was a pretty, in all pure hindsight, it was just a pretty miserable shoot. It was a miserable time. We were all away from home, which is never fun. It is what it is. And again, not a movie that I was, in charge of. Got to suggest things and say things, when it came to the editing, but. Look, I'll look at that one and I'll always think to me, you let me into that footage today. I think there's a better cut of that movie that exists. I'm not accusing anybody of anything. I'm just telling you, I think there's a better cut of that movie. The end. I don't know what else to say. I was not in charge of it. Whereas there is no better cut of whatever, the final episode of Veep. You know what I mean? It's exactly what I want it to be. And I'm not picking, pick any of the Veep episodes, pick, Curb episodes, pick my Seinfeld episodes. They are what I want them to be, which is, again, a very different thing.
Still so good, those episodes. Jim and I have been kind of going through a lot of your episodes the last few days. And, I'll
tell you something funny really quickly.
Go on.
I started watching Seinfeld with my daughter, which has been very fun. And
how old is she?
We were going, she's 14, almost 15. And we've been going through them kind of chronologically. And then we got sort of held up with summer camp and whatnot. And so then we started jumping around a little bit to just some of my episodes just so she could see them. And then we're going to go back and kind of watch it through again once she sees more of them, whatever. But boy, it's been both very fun and also very weird, sort of like watch it. Yeah.
I mean, I think they still look great, and they still work fantastically. I mean, I was laughing my head off yesterday watching Bizarro Jerry and the Susie. And what I like about what you've done is you've, coming into a show like that where there are these established characters and we know the characters so well, they're so well defined, yet you're able to, have this kind of playground environment where you can experiment with things and, test the boundaries of these characters. And
well, there were two things that I think went on basically when I was there, especially, and I've talked about this elsewhere a couple of times, and I've never really had a great name for it, but a lot of us there at that point, both first with Larry, but then really when Larry left and those of us that were left behind were fans of the show. We were the ones that had sort of studied the show. And in some ways, that is what we brought to the show. And whether you like that or not, it is what gives you things like the Bizarro Jerry, where I was playing very much with the roles that the sort of defined roles that these people have, and sort of almost not exactly breaking the fourth wall, but definitely like bouncing something off that fourth wall or kind of reflecting through it. But at the same time, I think there are also some observations that aren't necessarily breaking the fourth wall, but the observation, for example, in the Bizarro Jerry that starts the Bizarro Jerry episode, the launching, I'm sorry, not in the Bizarro Jerry, I apologize. in my episode, The Pool Guy. Sorry, I'm jumping to The Pool Guy for a second. And the idea in that I still love is just the acknowledgement that Elaine doesn't have a lot of female friends, that she's kind of a guy's gal, which is not... That was what the show was, but it had never perhaps been put into words. And I've known many girls like that hung with us guys, and I knew girls that didn't, and I understood how they didn't, mesh and whatever. And again, I'm not saying anything I did was magical. It was just when you could find those observations and bring something, again, it was there, but no one had sort of said it was there. And then what do you do with that? And that was the fun of it. And then, yes, with the Bizarro, again, playing with these roles that were there. So you get to these scenes of, Elaine being able to say, I can't keep coming into this apartment, day after day, whatever, going over the minutia. And Jerry starts to say a line about but today at the bank, and that bank story, I always joke, that's a show. That's a show we never got to see. Jerry at the bank was, probably, I shouldn't say probably, Jerry at the bank was definitely a piece of an idea that I always wanted to do that I never got to do. I tried pitching at Seinfeld and at Curb, it was the idea that there'll be lines, there'll be a VIP line and a regular line, and you get to go in the VIP line because you're a member or whatever, but then the VIP line moves slower than the regular line, and I think that was what that was the beginning of, but it wasn't ever said, whatever. And that's a show in another universe, only it wasn't. Anyway, somewhere there's an answer. Yeah.
Is it fair to say that there's, because I feel this with your shows, is there's a common thread of absurdist humor and magic realism, and I love that approach. I mean, I don't know if you'd agree with the magic realism, but I see that.
I'll say the following. I totally understand it. I never sat down and thought about it that way. For me, it was more a perspective of fucking with the norm, of breaking the format, of breaking what's not expected. And it's something I have loved doing and always loved doing. And I can point it out for those that want it. Check out the beginning of the Charlton Heston hosted episode of Saturday Night Live, where he falls asleep in the cold opening and wakes up, and the entire show is on the Planet of the Apes, and and they let me reshoot the opening montage with apes. So it's starring General Urko. It's all ape stuff, singing human Paul Westerberg from The Replacements. I mean, it was a format. It was screwing with the format. Certainly Bizarro Jerry, the Backwards episode, on Veep, the documentary episode. I mean, I do love it. It's one of my favorite things in the world. And so I will nod along to magical realism, but it was not coming from that as a standpoint, I guess. Yeah. But it is certainly influenced by reading and enjoying things in that direction. Absolutely.
And it's only ever just over that line, isn't it? We can almost reach over that line and touch it ourselves.
It's always trying to keep a foot in the Seinfeld world so that you're not going, I got to turn this off. And look, I think it's a hard line to walk. And there are definitely times, perhaps in our final season of Seinfeld, where sometimes things did get a little cartoony, and that happens. You know what I mean? But, you're trying to find that line. But trying to keep a foot in it so that the show is the show. And by the way, that's the thing with the Backwards episode. Again, love it or hate it, and I like 3/4 of it pretty much. The Kramer story doesn't exactly work, and there's a reason why, but anyway. What I was going to say is that it is definitely again, blame Alan Moore. It's all sort of Watchmen. If he hadn't deconstructed superheroes, I would have never learned, it's blame him and blame Frank Miller. If they hadn't deconstructed superheroes, I would have never learned what deconstructing was. And then I wouldn't have tried to deconstruct every sitcom I've ever worked on. But anyway, that's there you go. So there's an answer.
Well, I think results are fantastic. That's all I was going to say.
Yeah, definitely. I always feel like a bit of an ambassador for Seinfeld here in the UK, because it was treated really badly. It was always on very late at night before the Larry Sanders Show. It was played out of order. And I remember I used to kind of go into school and tell my friends, no, you have to watch the one I've taped from 2 weeks ago.
You gotta watch that first. Yeah,
watch that first. Yeah, I think this is a first for the Filmumentaries podcast. We're 30 minutes in or 35 minutes in. We haven't really talked about Star Wars yet.
We've had one question. We're 37 minutes in. We've had one question. So yeah, I apologize. Yeah.
No, it's great. I mean, David, I think we could do multiple episodes of each of your shows. So it's great to dip into that world. Where did Star Wars come into your life then? Was it you were, I guess, around 6 or 7 when it first came out?
I was 7 years
Perfect
old,
time.
and yeah, it was absolutely. I've always actually someone. I can't even remember who. I wrote a piece for somebody a couple of years ago that was actually about, my hypothesis was 7 is the perfect age for Star
I think
Wars.
It's the New York Times, I think.
No, I don't think it was the Times. No,
because I saw a Times article about it.
Maybe they snipped it.
They might have been snipped it or something. It's somewhere else. I don't remember where I wrote it, because what it was really about was it was about me showing my daughter, the one I just mentioned about watching Seinfeld, that I had at that point I had acquired an original print, a non-special edition 70 millimeter print of Star Wars and Return of the Jedi. And a friend of mine had Empire, and I waited till my daughter was 7, and then rented out a theater with a whole bunch of friends so that we could show our kids Star Wars, Empire, and Jedi the way they were meant to be shown. But where the story is really going is, 7 was just to me the perfect age, because I knew just enough where I could follow the whole story. I wasn't, when you're 6, when you're 5, I think you start to get a little bored in spots. So I loved it. I loved everything about it. I wanted to read everything about it, and that meant the comics, that meant any magazine, that meant storybooks, making ofs, whatever it was that I could find. But also, because I'm a 7-year-old kid, the toys. And obviously the toys sort of speak for themselves, and they definitely are connected to all the, the collecting that I do to this day. So I just 7 to me is pretty perfect. I mean, I'm sure 7 to 12 is probably pretty perfect in there anyway. But yeah, no, it was beyond perfect. And it's a funny thing where, despite the fact that, I think other than maybe like a comic book story that I wrote, I've never done anything, officially sci-fi. None of the work I've ever done overlaps even. Barely even like a centimeter, you know what I mean? Other than occasionally making a sci-fi reference or joke in Seinfeld or something like that. Like, I guess you could argue, Bizarro Jerry is a comic reference in the show, but I've never had the opportunity. However you want to say it, I've never found the opportunity. I've never been allowed to work in that world. I love it. I love it to this day. Maybe I love it because I haven't been allowed to work in it. Maybe that's part of it, But, obviously Star Wars, the biggie, but, all that stuff, all the genre films of the late 70s, early 80s, Conan, Blade Runner, the Arnold Schwarzenegger, those big action movies. I mean, I love all of that. I can't get enough of it.
I have to agree with you with the age. I mean, Jamie and I are, I think, 5 or 6 years apart. But David, I think I'm a year younger than you. And I saw Star Wars in the theater at 6 years old. And my brother and I went and hid in the bathroom. And then we went back to our seats and watched it again. Yeah. At 6 years old.
Like 7, you don't have to run to the bathroom. You get to the whole thing. But you obviously loved it enough to come back.
Yeah, we all have kids, and just that experience of having seen it at such a young age. And then I bought a Force Effects lightsaber, 10 years before I had my first son, and gave it to him at the age of 6, and he was just floored by it, and just turned it on, and it's just absolutely amazed.
I had one of those little moments where I showed my kids recently. I've got a 7-year-old, 14-year-old, and a 16-year-old, and it was my birthday last year, and they said, "Oh, for your birthday, you can pick a Star Wars movie and we'll watch it together." So I picked the first one. And at the end, my then 6-year-old, now 7-year-old, she said, "I kind of get why you're into this now." And I thought, that's enough for me.
Winner. Yeah, you won. Exactly. No, it's this funny thing where, look, I better folks than I can talk about, the way he brought together, mythology and whatever, but it's a hell of a story, and just the way it changed movie making. Again, I'm sure some people would argue about, the effect on the movie industry, blah, blah, blah. Sure. Okay. But just everything about it, that suspension of disbelief of, watching, whatever, a TIE fighter, an X-Wing, and those things are so real to me to this day. And in the, when I would go to when my kids were younger and, I would go off to like a San Diego Comic-Con or something and be like, okay, Daddy's leaving. I'm leaving on Wednesday. I'll be back on Monday. I'll see you in 6 days, whatever. But I'd bring home, even before they knew what exactly Star Wars was, I was bringing home this is Star Wars Lego and here's a light, and all of that kind of stuff. And, they loved it enough. And I'm not sure it had the effect it had on me, but that's okay. But I like that they like it at least. And nowadays, when we'll they want to go to these Comic Cons and things more than I want to go. I want to leave, and they're because the stuff I'm looking for isn't there anymore. But they want to stay. So yeah, no, I'm very happy with that. I couldn't ask for any more as a father. I will simply say in terms of what they like. Yeah.
I think we're all of an age, or we're old enough to kind of not really remember a time before Star Wars. I was born in '76, so my world has just been full of Star Wars since day one, really, or year one. My wife always jokes that I'm able to kind of walk past a yard sale and go, oh, there's a TIE fighter, or look at a wall of 100 T-shirts and go, oh, there's a Vader T-shirt.
Right.
I can just pick these iconic shapes out. And I'm sure that has something to do with the fact that I've watched the movies 100 times. I've made documentaries on them. I've, I read all the books, read all the comics, and everything else. But for you, was there, after you had all those toys as a kid, what was the point and what was the age that you're at when you kind of decided, I'm going to start collecting this stuff again, but this time I'm going to keep them in their boxes and present them?
It was definitely on my mind, sort of, a little bit during college occasionally. I was up in Boston, I was going to the really great comic book stores, in Cambridge and stuff. And that's where you were starting to see people, oh, look, they're selling an old Star Wars figure and whatever. But it was really when I made my move to Los Angeles, so it was really when the year I started on Seinfeld, which was 95, summer of 95. And it really was when I went to my first San Diego. And I guess part of it was, all throughout SNL, the first 3 years I was out of college, I was more or less living at the SNL offices. So I was still living at home, even though I was sleeping at the office, basically. So I didn't have my own place. But the second I sort of moved to LA and sort of had a place, it was sort of like, oh, these things can be acquired and these things can be had. And I wanted them back. I was, some stuff had survived. I certainly was never a kid that kept anything mint in package or anything like that. But even the ones that where I realized oh, my mom got rid of box number 2. I still had box 1, but there had been another box and it was clear she'd got rid of that. Again, I'm not talking about lost $1 million treasures. I'm just talking about my box of crap, where the desire to get that stuff back, but then also to get it back even better. And, the same was true with comic books, and those two things kind of, went hand in hand and led to the other stuff later on. But yeah, it really was 95 or so, like I said, when I started on Seinfeld. And it didn't hurt that for the first time in my life, I also had, just ridiculously disposable income. Certainly as a 25-year-old, I always say sort of single, living in a rental house, driving a leased car, having my meals basically paid for at work every day. And yes, working a lot, and I was at work a lot, but the ability to buy a Luke Skywalker was not an expense. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, You're in the land of disposable income. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I was about, I guess it would have been about 93, 94 for me when that Steve Sansweet book came out, the concept of screen to collectible, and there's that middle page of all the figures, and I was like, I didn't know that one existed, or that one. And me and my buddy Mark, we went to all of the yard sales and boot fairs here in the UK, and I kind of lived off trading those for years through university, really.
My order of things was, because I had basically bought all the Star Wars, all the Empire, and some of the Jedi. And then somewhere, I guess if Jedi's 83, so I'm 13 at that point, it started to seem like I shouldn't be buying action figures at that point. And I was definitely more hardcore comics. I dipped back in. I think I bought like the first 12 G.I. Joe figures when those came out in like 85, 86, because I just thought they were great. And I think I made it to like Snow Job and Wetsuit. Those were I like those two a lot. But so I kind of made it that far. And so the initial thing I did when I first, like, again, I was like, quote unquote, decorating my house, was I bought really nice loose versions of everything I could get and some of the ships and stuff. And so that was the start. And then from the loose, it was into the, well, what if I got a really nice one? And then from the nice one, it was like, well, what if I got one and even the hole wasn't punched, and then it just started to get crazy. And it just been downhill from there.
Yeah. And when was the leap from that to getting into the production items and the props and everything else?
It's funny. Again, Sansweet's very much to blame. His books for me were very much, just Bibles, but also, I don't want to call them shopping catalogs, but it was this thing, like every time a book of his came out, you would see something and go, I didn't know that existed.
Yeah.
And that happens to this day. I would literally, he now has the Rancho Obi-Wan Museum of his collection, which is a nonprofit museum that he runs up in Petaluma, California. And literally this last weekend, they had their, I'm sure I'm getting this wrong, I think it was like their 20th anniversary, and they did a YouTube video that you could watch where they showed highlights from his collection and 2 or 3 of the other big collectors that sit on the board. And there were props and toys and all sorts of, stuff. But there was a moment where one of the guys was showing stuff just from Steve's collection. And there was like these Japanese, like dancing, they were called like space opera figures. They like wind up and they more or less dance together. And I'm like, I've never seen these. And I've got to get the Chewbacca. You know what I mean? It was just like, so to this day, I'm finding things, that Steve Sansweet is showing me to some extent. But I started to know this stuff was around, and honestly, the first thing I ever came across was a Stormtrooper helmet that was advertised. It was an auction in Toy Shop magazine, which was at the time the newspaper that American toy collectors would advertise in and, buy out of. And I won this thing and actually ended up reaching out to Steve. I've told this story on my own show. Reached out to Steve, who I didn't know, but kind of, how does one say? I definitely used the Seinfeld thing to make sure he didn't think I was there to murder him. You know what I mean? It was like, I'm a real person. I'm not a crazy person. I'm a writer at Seinfeld, blah, 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 blah. I've got this helmet that I'm in the middle of purchasing. And I ended up making the deal so that the deal pended on me going over to Steve's place. He lived in LA at the time. And I got to compare my Stormtrooper helmet from Jedi to his Jedi helmet, and they matched up perfectly. And that was the check on the deal. The guy had agreed to that as the sort of the bona fide, of the deal, so to speak. And it was great, and got to meet Steve, which has been a wonderful, again, I don't pretend to be his best friend, but it's just been wonderful knowing him. And through knowing him, I've been invited to some various cool things over the year and gotten involved with a bunch of cool stuff. Got to go up to Lucasfilm a couple of times. And so that's been really fun. But also we were on vacation up near him this is now a couple of years ago, and I brought my family over for a tour. That was great too. So, fun stuff like that. So, yeah.
And that was the Return of the Jedi Stormtrooper helmet. Now,
yes.
Did something happen in the vacuum forming where it broke and stretched or something somewhat horizontally? So that
they're a little different. I mean, I think that's each one sort of is a lot less crisp, as they say. Yeah. But they are what they are. Yeah.
And it's collecting, you've already talked about, being in that writing room and trying to outdo each other with your, trying to be the funniest in the room. with collecting, you're competing against these people in a similar way to get hold of that kind of grail moment.
It's definitely true. I mean, it's funny, and this is definitely true. I've definitely come across people. It's strange. On the one hand, I do think I have a great collection, and people are always saying to me, "You have a great collection," and I understand that. I guess what I'll simply say is, I certainly don't judge myself or my value as a human being based on my collection or any of my collections, which unfortunately I probably do in terms of my humor. that is my defect. My value is definitely based on what I consider to be where I fit in the world of being funny. I don't feel that way as much about collecting, although, like I said, I'm aware I think my collection is good. I do see people that I do think that is how they, definitely value themselves. I'm not sure. I'm not sitting here saying that my comedy thing is healthy, but I'm pretty sure judging yourself on the collecting thing is definitely not healthy. That all being said, yeah, I've come up against people. There are people that I've collected against that I don't like. But by the way, there are people I collect against that I do like, and we get along really well. I've gotten to know them. They've gotten to know me. We attempt to chat about things. We try and, that we do butt heads occasionally, but we also will step out of each other's way for things. Oh, you really want that? I'm good. Oh, I really want that, and things like that. So, I think it's like anything else, which is, there's a healthy way of doing it. At least I like to think so. But
your co-host Ryan Condal on the Stuff Dreams Are Made Of, your podcast. Have you ever? I don't think I've come across it, so maybe I've missed it. Have you ever bid for the same item and one of you got it and the other didn't?
Not that he knows of. No, no, we've never. It's funny. We collect similarly, but at the same time, we're very different collectors. I don't know. He's very focused, on the idea of like the one great piece from a movie or something, and then he moves on. And there's a couple of exceptions, but he's very focused in that way. And I definitely, certainly with certain movies like Star Wars, I can't get enough, and I'm interested in all aspects of it. I'm interested in storyboards, marketing stuff. I mean, I'm interested in every part of it. And I'm interested as much in, I will simply say, the bunker bomb from Jedi, or, some jacket that a guy wore in the background, as I am in an actual Chewbacca's, like the great stuff and the not so great stuff. Because when it comes to Star Wars, I am definitely prop wise just obsessed with it. And, maybe a little bit to my own detriment, perhaps, if I got rid of some of the lesser pieces, but I love them. I mean, again, I don't think about them that way. They're not lesser to me. I do love them. But no, we've never really, I think there are definitely things where we've both been interested, but then have gone in different directions, where one of us stays on it and one of us moves on, or vice versa. So no, it has not happened, which is good, obviously. Yeah. But by the way, I guess what I will say is, and it's a funny thing, and again, now we're talking about sort of collecting and friendship. With my actual friends, I have never had a collecting problem. Meaning I've never gone head to head in a way that was bad. I've stepped aside. They've stepped aside. I've done versions of, I will not bid till you tell me you're bowing out, or if it sells for under $20,000, it's yours. But if it goes over 20, that's where you're out and I start bidding, or whatever the arrangement was. And by the way, that is included. This is not like I'm the greatest guy in the world. I've lent good friends money to help them, get something done, and knowing that they would pay me back and could pay me back, etc. I've always done that with friends. I guess what I've found is the people that turn out to be pieces of shit are the ones that, to some extent, I've had my collecting problems with. And ultimately, it's because they're untrustworthy pieces of shit. And I guess it is what it is. So I just find that the friendship is certainly more important than the collecting, and it usually works itself out if you're really my friend. I don't know what else to say. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of my questions was going to be about, the hunt and the experience and the research, and that's
sure.
and that community, and you've answered that question already. I mean, I spoke to Dan Lanigan, who owns the Blade Runner Hero Gun and a bunch of Indiana Jones stuff. you both know each other, and he talked about just that well, there's the thrill of the chase, but there's also just the appreciation and the adoration of that artifact, that piece of artwork. And one of the pieces that I love that you've got is that Macquarie Emperor Arrival painting.
Yeah.
Because not only because I saw Return of the Jedi when I was 7, I was taken to London to see it on the big screen, and that was my kind of Star Wars moment, I guess. But that of course holds so much history. You've got Ralph McQuarrie, you've got a scene which is everybody had been waiting for at this point, because originally that was Luke arriving that he painted, right? And he painted over it, and you can see that on the painting itself.
I don't know. If you look closely, if you know where you're looking, but
there's evidence
it's a funny thing of because of working on the Macquarie book. Again, it's a funny thing of like I probably know too much about some of the Macquarie pieces. You know what I mean? But no, I mean I would like it in any form. But yeah, no, to own an actual production, to own an actual Ralph McQuarrie production painting from, again, having bought those portfolios as a kid, as part of my collecting, and then rebought them when I started to reacquire things and wanting, the great stuff and whatever, and then to work on the book, but then also to have a collection of Ralph's stuff, and then to sort of cap it off with, an actual production painting. It's thrilling. And for me, it is so much about what I love about Star Wars, because it is the scene from the movie, but it is also so much about the making of and the history of how these movies were made, and Ralph's role in them, of bringing, some of George's ideas to life, and all of that stuff. And, the artwork, I love all the effects stuff, but certainly the Macquarie paintings, the Joe Johnston storyboards. I mean, I just like when you get to see that stuff and you get to sort of really see and feel how these movies were put together. It's just an incredible thing. And it's, I don't mean this, I'm not trying to be an asshole about this. I make jokes on the show sometimes about, I have not been the biggest fan of the prequels or what came, sort of after either. They're fine. And look, someone's Star Wars movie is always someone's first Star Wars movie. And so if you like it, good for you. I'm certainly not going to whatever. I don't collect them. But the way Star Wars was done was just, those 3 original movies were just done. The way, George, the interplay with George and the designers, I just think that way of making movies is just never happened again. Or it was a small period of time, and then people sort of moved on in a very different way, unfortunately.
I think in the book you say, or someone says, I don't know if it's Nilo Rodis-Jamiro, says, there'll be no one like Ralph again, or something like that, something to that effect.
And but and Nilo, and again, I don't know him, but he's being modest, because he was incredible, and like I said, I already brought up Joe Johnston. He was, any one of them would have been great, and all of them were there. Have you guys been watching? Obviously, I'm sure you have. Have you been watching the ILM?
Light and Magic.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. And you look around that room of that initial team that they put together, and it's just like, dear Lord. I mean, it's whatever. It's the, I don't know. I was about to say a year, and I started to realize, like, I don't even know what I'm saying. It's like the 39 Yankees. I think that's right. Where it's a murderer's row. You're just like, I cannot believe it. You know what I mean? Yeah. But that was what was so incredible. And also that thing of, they didn't, like, no one had ever done it, so no one could ever tell them that's wrong, or why are you doing that? And you have these people doing things that they would never be allowed to do. So that, like, Joe Johnston is doing storyboards, but then he's building things, and then he's painting things, and Ralph is doing paintings, but then he's doing storyboards, and then he's doing matte paintings, and they're just, they're trying stuff. And that is the thing, I think when you look at the movies, I don't know if there's a common thread to certainly the movies I love, if you, and again, I don't think I'm picking movies that are like, oh my God, where did that come from? But when you read some of these behind the scenes stories of obviously the Star Wars movies, but then something like Blade Runner, it's like, well, no one had ever done it, so we tried to do it. And, obviously that starts with 2001, but this thing of like, there were no rules, so we just kind of made it up as we went. And that's the thing I just, I think I'm most attracted to, both in terms of the movies I love, but then also the collecting. And Star Wars to me, it puts it all in a bundle. So again, there's a wide swath to it all, but Star Wars, Empire, Jedi, yeah.
When I was 12, my brother and I shared a room, not for long because we were getting on each other's nerves, but we got the Ralph McQuarrie portfolio piece, and just sort of haphazardly pinned them on the wall and just had them all spread out. And just to know that you have the shuttle arrival, Vader arriving, that's just amazing to me. And I it's almost like you're the keeper of it, so you're the preserver of it. Like it belongs in your museum, and it's your piece to have. And I was so inspired by the movies, and I always wanted to work for Lucasfilm and Industrial Light and Magic as a map painter, and had a Skywalker Ranch t-shirt when I was 14. And I collected all these books, all the reference books. And when I got to ILM, there was a kind of attitude of let's not admit that we're big Star Wars fans because it doesn't look good on us. And if you have tons of Star Wars stuff in your portfolio, they're not going to hire you anyway. But I'd walk through the mat department when I was there, and all the artists had, from Star Wars to Jedi, the art of Star Wars, they had them all tucked away in these little bookcases behind them. And I'm going to partially blame you and Ryan, as well as blame Prop Store, for the fact that I acquired the Ralph McQuarrie piece, the pencil drawing of Leia's apartment, which is right behind me on this side.
Oh, there, yep. Other side. Way, yep. Oh, yep.
And, I looked through all the reference books that I've had, since I got it, and I couldn't find it. And then, Jamie and I were going to be talking to you, and I thought, okay, I don't have, and I should have, considering, what I do for a living, the Ralph McQuarrie book that you've co-written. And I opened it up, and there are the images.
Was, yeah, no. Yeah. I mean, the McQuarrie book for me was, it was such a labor of love because, we always joked, I wrote it with Brandon Allinger and Wade LaJose, and, we are all three of us, collectors. Wade is a graphic designer in his own right and knew Ralph personally, which was obviously a wonderful perspective. But we made the book that didn't exist. We made the book that we wanted. And we really tried to make the book where, I think we've updated it once, and I'm hoping someday we get to update it one more time, where every time we find anything else, we've tried to put it back in. And, for anyone who's gotten it or had it delivered by Amazon, and it's, it's like 800 pounds and it's very heavy and whatever. Yeah. But, it was our attempt, and the late, wonderful Jonathan Rinsler basically said this, which is we treated it like it was we treated it like it was an art book. This is the master works of Picasso, and it's going to be complete. And even if that means that there is a section, and we always joke about it, there's a section when you get to Bespin where they tried every color combination for the Bespin, like citizenry. It's just colors of, you turn the page and it's just different colors. And it is both the most boring, but then it kind of wraps around and becomes fascinating that they did this many color tests trying to see what the people of Bespin should be wearing. And then it becomes really interesting, even though, it's kind of boring. But I guess what I'm sort of saying is we wanted the book where the Bespin stuff was in it. And to be able to make it, to be able to participate in it, to basically get to be up not only at the archives and go through stuff, to have George, which he hasn't done on a lot of Star Wars books, write a little thing and answer a couple of questions for us, to be able to reach out to even well-known directors like J.J. Abrams and like Chris Nolan and get them to respond to questions about McQuarrie because of what he and Star Wars meant to them. Like I said, it's sort of like, yes, there was definitely a collecting element for me of like, well, now I know where everything is and now I know, whatever. But at the same time, it was also just, whatever, 14-year-old me wanting the definitive reference book. And that's what I loved about it, just the whole project and everything about it. But yeah, getting to go up to the archive and hang out in there and photograph and then later, scan these, pieces and really go through. And I mean, we went through every drawer. We found things that had been not identified, had been mislabeled, that were like, like, what's this doing here? Just little, again, some of the discoveries were small, but God, it was just, we just wanted it to be definitive. And I'm truly proud of it. So yeah, I'm glad you
Do you know what keeps coming across my mind? It's like I've got myself at the bottom here, Jim in the middle, and you at the top, David. It's like the hierarchy of Star Wars fandom here. So
see, I have more of a 3. I have a 3.
I've got the portfolios, I've got the figures. Jim's worked for ILM, has a Macquarie piece, and you have all of your things.
But Jamie, you've interviewed everyone. I mean,
you've interviewed everybody, and also I think we can get you can get a starter Macquarie piece. I think it's missing from your wall. So. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. My green wall. I interviewed Nilo actually, and he's an absolute sweetheart. Such a nice guy, and we've stayed in touch. He sent me a Christmas drawing with a Han on the Tauntaun.
Oh, that's excellent.
And season's greetings and things like that. So those are the, I feel like I've dipped my toe into this world that I love, and that's why I do this podcast. One of the things I wanted to pick up on about the book was Jim and I were talking a couple of days ago about the kind of relationship between Ralph McQuarrie and Norman Reynolds. Ralph and Norman both being production designers in a way. Did you get a good sense of how that relationship worked?
Yeah, I mean, I never want to, you don't want to put words in anyone's mouth. It seemed fraught, I will simply say. I think there was a sense of, it's a little bit like that famous line of, you can write it, but you don't have to say it, George. You know what I mean? It's like you can draw it, but you don't have to build it. And I think there was an element of that, and that's okay. That's all right. I think it's also partially why Ralph went to London on the second film, because he wanted to try and be in the trenches and be a little both closer to it, but also in the mix more in terms of the designs being brought to life. But again, it is, it's one of those very tough things about, I think movie production, but again, I also think it's one of the things that makes it so interesting, which is to say, don't get me wrong. If everything in Star Wars looked exactly the way Ralph McQuarrie drew them, I'm sure it would be a very interesting movie. I'm not saying it isn't. But part of what's interesting, and I'm gonna come back in 3 seconds to that concept. So make sure you get me back to that, which is years ago, and I maybe have mentioned this. This is a good Star Wars story from me that I always love. At some point, after many years, and I don't remember what the anniversary was. Let's say it was the 20th, maybe it was the 20th, 25th, something like that. If I looked at a calendar, I would be able to make sense of it. Must have been the 25th or the 30th. Must have been the 25th. The 25th anniversary of Empire Strikes Back, they kind of started to welcome Irvin Kershner back into the fold. He had been, again, the things that nobody ever talks about. He had kind of been pushed away, ostensibly, again, I'm not putting words in anyone's mouth, that, the Empire had gone radically over budget. George had to take out that next loan. He shot things without coverage that, I think perhaps George might have tried to cut but couldn't cut because he didn't have anywhere to go. And by the way, many of the things that we love about Empire are because of Kershner, but he had definitely been... He was, again, an unofficial persona non grata, it seemed like. And then there was this moment where all of a sudden he started reappearing and he started doing autograph signings and was at shows and whatever. And in L.A., there was a wonderful screening at the now defunct ArcLight Cinemas for the anniversary where he was interviewed. I don't even remember who interviewed him. And he went into such wonderful detail about Yoda. And what he was talking the most about with those Yoda scenes, I remember him being very specific. He talked so much about how prepared Mark Hamill was, how Mark Hamill really not only knew his own lines, but knew like Yoda's lines too, because he was just like, they didn't know how it was going to be. And so it had to be perfect. And that they were so worried about how bad the puppet might look or how ridiculous the audience would think it was. Not that it was, but that they were so worried about that they obsessed on the little bits of business, and they came up with all of those things for Yoda in terms of, him, going through Luke's stuff and, all of that and his attitude, just all of that stuff and the little bits and the pieces that obviously make those scenes so perfect. And what he's talked about was as he put it, and these are his words, and I've never forgotten them. They are a guiding principle for me, both what I love about Star Wars, but also what I just like endeavor to in my own sort of creative pursuits, which is basically like art is where sort of like ingenuity meets limitations, basically. That basically it's those limitations and the overcoming of those limitations that allows art to exist. And just, in a fabulous way. And so where I was going with that is, let's now go back to that idea. If everything looked the way exactly Ralph had drawn it, whatever, I'm sure it would have been really cool. But part of what made it so cool was that John Malo was like, well, this is great, but like a person, like you can't make an outfit like this. And so this is how you have to make an outfit. Like this is how a uniform has to be. And then, oh, well, this isn't going to work. We need to hire a sculptor for this. And then it becomes a little different because it's going to work. And what everyone has to do to make it work is part of what makes Star Wars so incredible, as opposed to just, in some ways nowadays, with all the digital and whatnot, I guess in some ways maybe Ralph would have drawn it and then they just would have figured out a way to like digitally make it all of that. And without those limitations, I think the limitations are what makes Star Wars great. Like, let's never ever forget that in the, the original draft, before they had to cut, whatever, like 2 million out of the last 2 million out of the budget, the Death Star and where Princess Leia were being kept prisoner were two separate things. It was two separate. It was, I believe, the Bespin was the prison planet, and then there was the Death Star was the weapon. And when they had to cut that last million, I think it was $1 million out of that budget, out goes whatever, the Cloud City, and all of a sudden, what if it's all on the Death Star the whole time? And it just seems like a no-brainer now, but if your budget is unlimited and you don't have anyone saying you have to cut $1 million, you never make that change. And for all I know, Star Wars is as bad as people might have thought it was going to be before it came out back then. You know what I'm saying? And so,
absolutely.
Anyway, I don't even know what you asked me, but there's an answer to something.
No, but the point you made there as well about the blurring of those lines between the departments, allowing them to do what they do and, dip a toe into the next department. Like Nilo said to me, when I drew Slave One, he said I drew it, but I didn't draw it with too much detail. I just gave a hint of the detail because that's the modeler's job to make that, and then it's the effects guy's job to light it and to shoot it, and But he said I could be there if I wanted, and I.
Oh, I was just saying, but let's even go one step back from him handing it to the Maulers. To hear those stories sometimes of like, Nilo eventually, but even Joe and Ralph working on stuff, they would go back and forth on things. And then it would be like, and Ralph would be the first to go, oh man, Joe nailed the basics of, whatever, like the snow speeder. But then Ralph added a little something and Joe's like, oh, that was really cool. But it's like, so who designed it? I don't really, nobody, all of them. I mean, that's what's so incredible. Yeah.
And they start working over each other's
Absolutely.
each other's drawings.
And let's not forget George coming in and out and going, I like this, I don't like that, think of this. We don't even know. We can't even, sometimes they would remember things George told them, and sometimes who knows what he said or didn't say that pointed them in a direction or a reference or a photo or whatever it was. And that is the process. And I will simply say, in my own world, and again, I work in, mostly comedies where, let's just simply say, in some cases, production design and things like that are a little more overlooked. Do you know what I mean? People are not necessarily raving about those things. But, when I look at, like, for example, like our props on Veep, I'll say like our production design, what made our production design incredible was how people thought we were shooting it in Washington, D.C., and we weren't. And sometimes we were shooting in buildings that we were recreating, and sometimes we were just shooting in buildings that suggested things. And so it added a level of reality to it that the show would not have been the same without that level of production design. And then certainly on the prop side, I cannot tell you how fun on something like Veep, and again, what department? Well, it's kind of props, and it's a little bit of art department, it's a little bit of production design, like making things like, and I will take some credit, but I will also share credit. Like when in the final season, when we had to create New Selena Now, just like the phrase, but also the layout of it. it is the thing one of the things I'm most proud of is just that like campaign sign of New Selena Now. It's like I'm thinking about like I saw someone is bootlegging them and making like phone cases, and I'm thinking when I update my next iPhone, I may get a New Selena Now iPhone case just because to this day I love that design, and I know I worked on it. But so did a whole bunch of other people, and that's what I love about it. And that's the process when it's working, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
The easiest
Yeah,
way.
and it's coming up with a design that makes sense, isn't it? And if somebody's making an iPhone case of it, you know you're onto a winner.
You got something. You got something. Exactly. Yeah.
We're talking about the pragmatic versus. I mean, Macquarie is a production designer or production artist, concept artist. He's far from flamboyant, you know. I mean, he was in the Korean War. He has a very pragmatic sense of kind of the engineering of illustration. So it's interesting that, you know, there would be a bit of maybe tension with Norman Reynolds, who's the production designer who has to get things built, and so it's kind of no wonder that a lot of what appeared on the screen in the first Star Wars movie looks so similar to Macquarie's work, because his work, I feel, is so pragmatic. But you know, we always kind of hope that we know more than most people about Star Wars, or take this pride in the minutiae. And I mean it in the sense of, you know, I say this, Jamie and I talk about this, that we're almost more fans of the behind the scenes than the films themselves at this stage.
Well, only because we've seen the movie so many times,
and uncovering that information. And the one thing, you know, in the book that you've written that I just kept bypassing in all my other reference Star Wars books is the Dagobah stuff, and just how Macquarie wanted it to be this sort of mushroom fungal ground, you know, spores, almost more like Alex Garland's Annihilation in a way, as opposed to just sort of this Everglades swampy, you know, giant banyan tree situation. And that would have been far out. I mean, that would have been really cool, because the whole thing with Yoda and that whole scenario is kind of hallucinogenic in a way, you know, and just I'm complimenting you on the book in that it really gets into Ralph's mind, and, you know, who he was as an artist and as a person and as a kind of artist philosopher.
I remember in the early days of like one of the pieces, I think it was the Jawa, whatchamacallit, Sandcrawler. Yes, yeah. Sorry, Sandcrawler Desert. You know, like there are things on it. I remember like where in Ralph's mind, like this open. Now you never see it open, and it doesn't open, but that's how he was thinking, and he was always worrying about it. It's all in the book. He was always worrying about like, well, how does that gun fire? Like where, like if we're in the center of the Death Star, like what does that look? You know, he was thinking about those things, and like, well, how does carbon freezing work? Which I guess I love that anybody was thinking about those kinds of things. And then there are some that are just so simplistic that just, you know, again, some of these shapes and ideas like the Lobot drawings, like of just Lobot, that to this day are just still just super duper and their own thing, and they just like I'm drawn to it. So yeah.
What he's really good at is that kind of suggestion of how something might work. It doesn't have to have it completely defined or broken down.
But you never, in watching, and again I don't mean this in a bad way, it's the difference a little bit between, I think, a little bit of Jedi in the first two movies. In the first two movies, you don't necessarily know how anything works, but you don't think twice about any of it. And you think twice a little bit in Jedi about a couple of things. Mm-hmm. And then in the prequels, you're constantly thinking about stuff. Yeah. I mean, to this day, I'm not sure they've really figured out. And I watch it all. I love it all. My kids watch it, so I watch it with them. But every time they try and do a cityscape on one of these planets, like it doesn't really make any sense. And I don't have an answer, but what they're doing doesn't make any sense. It always ends up being, you know, like like, I don't understand. They're flying, but there's no rules. Like, I don't understand what it is. How does a city exist? Like, it just, like, none of it makes any sense. I understand it was a great looking production drawing somewhere, and then they brought it to life, but it doesn't really make sense. And that is a huge Ralph difference. Yeah.
And that's what Ralph brought. That's what Joe brought. That's what Nilo brought. That legitimacy to something that could function in the real world. And the employment of Nilo being a non-sci-fi fan, a non-film fan, just an industrial designer, is where a lot of that stuff comes from, I'm sure. Your show, The Stuff Dreams Are Made Of, what was the kind of impetus for that between you and Ryan? Because part of collecting, part of bidding on things is you want to kind of keep it a little bit quiet and, place a bid that was unexpected. But here you are on this show kind of not only talking about your collection, but talking about upcoming auctions and, the aftermath of auctions.
I will say the following with that auction, which was for basically the Stuff Dreams Are Made Of. It's a show hosted by me and Ryan Condal, who's the House of the Dragon showrunner, the new Game of Thrones show. And we talk prop collecting, although we talk collecting also in general. We talk about a lot of collecting, and we collect other things. We bring other people on to collect other things. So it's prop collecting into the world of collecting. And, someone said to me, like, how could you go on that show and tell people what you were going to bid? There was a big X-Wing prop auction. It was a pyro, a really verging on, I guess, to use prop terms, verging on a hero. Basically, even though a pyro model is meant to be blown up, it was one that looked like it was Red One, and they had worked on it really nicely, and so it was probably one of the best ones I'd ever seen. And I was talking about what I would bid, and then talked about what I bid afterwards, whatever. And look, I don't mean this in a bad way. Nobody listening to our show is bidding against me on that. You know what I mean? I just don't.
You sure Gus and Peter aren't got half an ear on it?
I don't think so. I don't think so. Gus maybe occasionally sometimes, but I was relatively sure that like the Peter Jacksons of the world, unfortunately, were not listening to The Stuff Dreams Are Made Of, which is fine. But it's funny. And I give Ryan the credit. It was Ryan's idea that we do this thing, and when he sort of said it, I understood it instantly and was like, oh yeah, let's do that. That'll be fun. And one of the things we've always tried to do is we've sort of always tried to talk about the show as it's very much like a conversation that Ryan and I would have anyway. Now, obviously, sometimes we bring guests on, but it's very much a conversation that he and I would have about props anyway, except we're trying to share it with you. And sometimes that's, we start the show talking about just what's new in props, and that's the equivalent of me calling and going, hey, guess what's new, and then having that conversation. And then sometimes it's also, hey, what's bugging me? And sometimes it's, did you see that thing? And so that's how we, basically that's how these shows are kind of put together. Yes, we do bring on guests. We bring on people with other collections, people we know, people we want to talk to about things. We do deep dives into individual props. We've done one onto the Stormtrooper helmets. We did one onto, we did a pulse rifle one. We're going to do more of those to come. So again, the conversation is always like, kind of like, letting our audience be a little bit of a fly on the wall. And with these last couple of auctions, it just was a logical thing where I knew win or lose, and I lost, it was going to be interesting. And I certainly I didn't necessarily want to like be recording myself or filming myself while I was bidding. It's not that level of whatever, but it was an attempt to kind of like take the audience through both what it was like to try and like think about a large purchase, to justify the large purchase, to gear yourself for the large purchase, to bid over what you thought, to lose, to what the ramifications of the losing, the depression. I mean, it was trying to take people,
it's great,
through that journey. And
I'm sure one of the questions a lot of people ask you is about, why don't you put your stuff in a museum? And in a way, this show is your museum as such. You're
it's
taking
a little
us
bit
into
of our
the
museum.
experience.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of our museum. And look, I'd love to put my stuff in a museum. And then someday I hope to someone will ask me to, with my comic art, which I have a very large original comic art collection, I have lent things. There's a comic art museum, there's a Comic Con museum down in San Diego now. They have a Spider-Man exhibit, and I have pieces in that Spider-Man exhibit. There was a big Marvel exhibit that was traveling around the United States. It's still traveling around. I had stuff in that exhibit during year one, which at this point was 3 or 4 years ago, and perhaps I will again, or a different exhibit. So I'm open to that as a concept. It's a little weirder in that, George Lucas obviously still has his archives and collects and, whatever. So in some weird ways, I don't necessarily know if people really want to see my stuff because there's still George's stuff, and there were traveling exhibits, which I love when he does. The last one I went to was actually at the O2 Arena.
The Icons one, or whatever.
Or was that Icons or Identities or
Identity? That was Identities. Yeah,
went to that twice, I think. I mean, I loved it. I was in London twice and went. So anyway, I don't know, but I would show my stuff off in a museum. But I mean, I love collecting it. I guess that's.
I mean, George doesn't have everything anyway. I mean, he has his.
No, he doesn't. But he has a lot of great stuff.
Yeah, and he has his museum coming up. But something like the X-wing showing up, that
sure, but he does.
It's almost like no one knew about it.
No, that's absolutely true. And so, but he does have a pretty good X-wing of his own.
Sure, for sure.
He can put in his museum. Yeah. So I'm not sure he's worried.
I think that's a great part of your show is. I was hoping you'd win the X-Wing. I was hoping you'd get it. It was a point of entertainment. Is he going to get it? It was like a cliffhanger.
I do appreciate that, and I do think God bless the people that listen to our show. People were pulling for me, which was really nice. Absolutely fucking worthless, but really nice. Didn't help in the least. I mean, I lost.
But I think one of the best parts
all the thoughts and prayers, as it turns out, nothing.
It turns out they don't work.
Yeah.
One of the strengths of the show, I think, is that for the people that can't afford to go to auction and bid on these, people are living vicariously through the people that do it. I mean, and the two of you, it's like, I really hope they get this, or what do they have next, and what's in your collection, and it's like just having that dream,
And the only thing I will say also though is, like, look, we talk about these big ticket items, but I don't know. There are times where Ryan and I stress as much over the $600 item of like, I really like it, but is it really worth $600? I mean, and I know that sounds silly, but when you're, I guess, as obsessed as I think I am, we are, I can, give me a $30 prop and give me a $30,000 prop, and I can talk about them and dig into them and obsess on them. Is it real? What is its provenance? What does it mean? Where does it fit into my collection? Do I need it? Don't I need it? Do I want to reach into my pocket? Do I want to get rid of something to cover the cost of the $30? Whatever it is, I can make that conversation. I have those conversations because it's about the item and never about the dollar. But yes, there is definitely the dollar side of things that is both fun, off-putting, and by the way, as we've seen in all collectible fields during sort of, the COVID, whatever we're calling it now, pandemic, post-pandemic, whatever, collectibles went insane. And so all of a sudden, and again, these are arbitrary lines in the sand, but things where, I might have sat here and said to you like, oh, wow, that's going to be like $30,000 or $40,000, which is not an insignificant amount of money. Now, all of a sudden, it's $200,000. And I'm not saying that's impossible, but that's a whole different discussion level of, do I want that? I mean, and by the way, and it exists in any realm, because all of a sudden the $100 piece is $1,000. And so do I want that? I mean, again, pick your poison, but definitely one of the sort of COVID collectible effects, I guess. I don't know.
Well, had this been 6 months ago, I would have asked you if you were concerned about the collective idea, like the Spice Dow or the Dune Dow, as it was then called, buying the Hodorowski's Dune book. I would have asked you if that was something that would concern you, as these groups of people getting together to own something. But of course, all of that went completely tits up. Yeah. They've dissolved the Dow. They're trying to sell it.
That was about as perfect an end result as I could have asked for. What I really want is just one of these morons. I keep hoping that at some point someone will slip me like, "Hey, we shot it, we scanned it." It is a crime that the Jarodowski Dune book is not, that I can't go into Taschen and buy a even if it was a $1,000 book that later came out in like paperback, 7 years later, that there isn't the Taschen Dune book to buy.
Yeah. Because it's the first thing I said, and actually one of the guys at Taschen DM'd me and said, what do you know? Have they bought the rights? And I said, no, the rights have not been bought, and they're about to realize this.
Yes,
I even had the guy who put in the $2 million on this show. I just thought, this is not going to go well.
Yeah. No, it ended exactly the way you would think. Look, unfortunately with these numbers, and I've seen it a lot with comic art, and I think we're seeing it a bit starting to with props is obviously not just the prices, but look, people buying as investments. And again, it is what it is, and nothing I can do about it. And I always talk about, I'm sure when I came along into the prop scene and paid some, money for some things that at the time had never gone as high as I bid them, although now in retrospect those numbers are, insignificant in some ways. I'm sure the quote unquote older collector then was like, fuck that guy, and fuck him for bidding that. Like, why would you ever spend whatever, $50,000 on a Star Wars helmet? Screw that guy for, raising the market. But that is the case with, I think, all collectibles. You just work your way backwards, and there's always a generation that's angry at the new guy spending money. If someone loves something, I'm all for it. I do get bummed out when it's like investment cartels and, groups buying it and, whatever. That's the part that bums me out, just because if you love it, more power to you. I guess, the guy that I'm pretty aware of who beat me on the X-Wing, and all I can say is he loves it. And
Right.
It wasn't an investor or anything crazy like
Good.
that. And I wish he were dead, and I wish I owned it. But that
And
being
you wish
said,
you were in his will, yeah.
Yes, but I wish, but at least he loves it for all the good reasons, and that's that's what I will say. Is kudos to him for doing what the rest of us couldn't, but he loves it. He did it for the right reasons, as far as I'm concerned.
It's interesting to think of you as writer and comedy writer, and I think you're a curator. Like the Ralph McQuarrie book, you're like a museum curator.
No one pays me. No one pays me to curate. They pay me to comedy write. Yes,
true. But
it
I
allows
almost,
me to curate. Yeah.
Considering like you're not buying, your Star Wars collection is tasteful. It is like you're building your own little museum, and it's again, it's like furthering on that kind of curation.
I could bore you to death. There's a reason for every piece I've ever bought, and there's also a reason for pieces I didn't buy. And there's some of them, I brought this up recently, and again, there's a tinge of regret to it, which is to say, Gus Lopez, who has a wonderful, wonderful collection, has a couple of guns of like Empire guns in his collection that I think at some point or another I had the opportunity, not specifically to buy them before he did, but simply to, like, one like it or whatever. And I always turn them down because like the Empire rifles, like the Hoth rifles, they just looked like rifles to me. They just never were as Star Warsy as some of the other various Rebel blasters and whatnot.
Silver tip and
no, not the silver tip one. I'm talking about the long rifle looking ones.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean?
The ones where they're in the trench.
Yes, exactly. And they just kind of looked like rifles. Yes, they got some stuff stuck on them. So I never bought them because they never seemed Star Warsy enough for me. And now, all these years later, do I wish I'd bought one for the F of it? Yeah, I do wish I had bought one just that I would have one in my collection for those reasons. But I still stand behind the notion that design-wise, it's not in my top 50 Star Wars designs, and that's not a punishable by death crime. There are some designs that are better than others, and there are things that I like more than others, and that ain't one of them. It's why I didn't buy it. Like I said, nowadays, well, it's Empire. It would be fun to have. I've got some other things that would have gone with it that would have been neat, but I know why I didn't buy it. That's the easiest way I can express it. And so the curation, if you will, is very much me, right? Again, I don't pretend it's anyone else, and you can go, oh, you're crazy. You should have gotten that. Those, the trench scene on Hoth, those are great scenes, and anything connected to it. You're not wrong. I just, for me, no. And that, like I said, my collection, for better or for worse, is me.
This is an obvious question, but and you're probably asked it a lot. Do you have a favorite Star Wars piece that you own?
Boy, it's so hard.
A couple?
It's so hard. I mean, look, there are the obvious biggies. I have an original Chewbacca mask from the original film. It was a Chewbacca mask. It was one of, I believe one of two that were used. It was then later, it was turned into Mala for the holiday special.
Okay.
There's
And then,
the answer to that question. Yeah,
Yes.
I did wonder. Yeah. Interesting.
but it's still chewy, pretty much. It has some lighter fur in it, but I'm not touching it, not restoring it. It's great. It went back to Stuart Freeborn, who was going to reuse it for Empire, and then was angry at the modifications that a young makeup special effects artist by the name of Stan Winston did to it, and he angrily shoved it in a garbage bag and stuck it in his, thank God, moist, damp attic, where it lasted for 30 odd years and showed up a couple of years ago. That's pretty incredible. I have a helmet. I have a screen matched from both Empire and Jedi, a Darth Vader helmet. That's pretty special. Those would be up there. The Macquarie we talked about already. Obviously, that's pretty much up there. I've got some pieces I'm quite happy about. Yeah.
Good.
It's difficult to know how to tie this up, but let's just kind of talk about what's coming up on the show next. So what have you got coming up on the stuff the Dreams Are Made Of for the fourth season?
I believe it's our fourth season. I think we're hoping to kind of get going in September again, and I'll give you a spoiler right here. I think we're going to start, as we rightfully should, with a big House of the Dragon prop tie-in. And I can't say more than that, but I will simply say we are attempting to take advantage of the 10 million people that watched the first episode of House of the Dragon on Sunday night, and hoping that 7 or 8 of them tune in to Stuff Dreams Are Made Of. So we're going to kind of go that way as a starting point, and jump kind of back into it. But we're hoping to kind of get something going in September. We're trying to get a couple under our belt so that we don't get caught in the, oh my God, we have to record one this weekend. We got caught there a little bit, and it was hard. There were definitely times where he was shooting in Spain, I was shooting in Washington, D.C., and we were, recording in weird hotel rooms and stuff. And we'd love to just occasionally have, okay, it's not working this week, let's just air one, and we'll burn one off, and then we'll figure it out next week. And so we want to get a little ahead of ourselves. So that's what's coming up. But we're coming out of the gate with House of the Dragon, and I'll simply say perhaps something in the sword realm, and I'll leave it at that.
I think that's a perfect spot to cut there.
And as with every season and every episode, there'll be Star Wars, because it's Star Wars in every episode. It, one way or another, leads its way back. Yeah.
All right, nice one. Thanks so much, David. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely, a real pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Cheers.
Thanks, David.
Take care. Well, I hope you enjoyed our conversation with David Mandel there. Big thanks to Jim for connecting us and for co-hosting. You're an absolute star, mate. Thank you. I still can't really believe we've pulled it off. David Mandel, for goodness sake. Writer of Seinfeld and Curb and Veep. It's kind of bonkers. Right, next up is David's co-host, apparently a huge fan of my Filmumentaries for many years, listener of all episodes of this podcast, and, more importantly, showrunner on HBO's House of the Dragon, Ryan Condal. I mean, it's getting pretty crazy on this podcast right now. Ryan's first episode of the show, as David said, has had some 10 million viewers, and the second episode had even more. I haven't recorded our conversation yet, but I know it's going to be great. Thanks for joining me, and I really do hope you can do so again for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.